How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Geek-Stew. And today, guys, welcome back to another Conspiracy Theories with Ike. You might hear my voice. I'm actually a little sick. I live in Indiana, and apparently the other day, the weather wanted to go from like 90 degrees to 60 overnight, and my sinuses just like imploded. It felt like I got hit in the face with a steel chair. So, anyhow, let's get into it. So today, guys, we're actually going to be talking about a theory that sort of relates to our last video. The last video wasn't really 100% about this, but it did have a sort of interpretation of this. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit as we kind of get into the meat of this theory. But last time we talked about God's Last Wish. God's Last Wish was a really great video. I've had some good feedback from it, even some people who commented on it. So thank you to those who, said something, said you appreciated the video or liked it. Now, mind you, all of this information I'm going to provide you today about this other theory is a similar process as last time. A lot of it came from Reddit, so bear with me as we kind of get into the details of it. But today, guys, we're going to talk about God's ego death. Sorry if the camera is a little weird because I did have to adjust it briefly, so if this is not like the same frame / shot as the last one, my apologies, but we're going to jump into this. I kind of mentioned already, this sort of relates to our last video about God's last wish, so we'll kind of get into that later a bit. But that being said, basic definition is God's ego death is as follows. Basically, it is the let me rephrase. We have to start basically what ego death means, but this sort of also refers to the whole entirety of God's ego death. But an ego death is basically the complete loss of a subjective self-identity, meaning that in some way, shape, or form, basically you lose yourself. But typically it's not being referred to as a bad thing. Typically it's being referred to as sort of an enlightenment issue, or potentially a change of mindset. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have an ego death, but it is certainly a change and or transformation, if you will, of the self. That being said, to go beyond just the basic definition, and I'll give some credits to some people at the end, because let me tell you, when I was researching this, basically all the information I got was sort of secondhand information from other people, which I thank them very greatly, because it was certainly interesting having to go through all this and not really understanding it, but then getting sort of explanations on Reddit of all places. But beyond that, basically the base definition of just losing oneself and that whole process is that basically the concept of God changing his mindset. Now, this specific theory, and I think that there are other things that could build into this. So when we talked about God's last wish, basically we had the concept of God's ego death. This sort of goes into it by saying that in God's last wish, he originally thought that existence was the way to enlightenment, or basically the option, right? Existence was what he needed to do. God's ego death meant that he had a change in mindset where he determined that existence was no longer the goal, that non-existence was the goal. In this case, it refers a little bit more to God's temperament and his mindset from the Old Testament of the Bible to the New Testament of the Bible. There are a lot of theories as to why this changed, but for people who maybe don't know, I actually grew up in the Christian church. I know a little bit about the Bible, but for people who may not know, the God in the Old Testament and a lot of the stories of the Old Testament, you sort of see this very vengeful, wrathful God, flooding the earth and everything else. And then eventually he kind of changes over to a new leaf. In the New Testament, he's more of a forgiving and, and loving God. And I'm not really going to get into that a whole lot, but there's sort of a reasoning for that. A lot of people think why he had that change. So we'll kind of talk about that here in a second. But basically, the goal and main premise of this is the change of mindset. God's last wish kind of included that change of mindset. But now we're going to kind of talk about sort of the base ideology that basically talks about why we see the change of the God of the Old Testament to the God of the New Testament. So So the last section was sort of probably really just, wow, okay, God's ego death, concept of ego death. So we've kind of introduced the basic concept of an ego death. What does that entail? What does that look like? If you or I were to have an ego death, what does that look like? So we've kind of already determined what that looks like as a general rule. And we also have kind of already determined, how did that kind of relate back to God's last wish and everything else. So now we have to talk about what caused this change. So the theory in the change of mindset kind of goes as follows. And this is obviously just one of, I would assume, many theories about how his mindset changed and everything else. But basically, the thing that I read, at least from, Reddit, of course, mind you, this is all, third-hand knowledge. Basically, the change in mindset occurred in the Old Testament during the events of Sodom and Gomorrah. So basically, the story of angels visiting the citizens, there is the whole concept of them going down, trying to really gather and determine the extent of the depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah. And basically, there's a story about the citizens wanted to assault the angels as they hid inside of someone's home. And basically, the story goes that they didn't just want to assault them, that they did. That they did, in fact, force themselves on the angels, which leads to our next point, that the angels weren't just angels, it was God. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, how is it just God? Now, there's a lot of stuff that kind of the people use as proof for this concept, that it wasn't just angels, that it was God. And one of them is that after they tried to, or that they did assault the angels blinded the men. Now, people throughout the rest of the Bible, you never see a mention of an angel with any kind of power like that. The only other time that you see someone with that power is Jesus in the New Testament, because he was able to blind, I think it was Saul. So basically, you have this concept that the angels weren't just angels, it was God. God came down to earth, experienced this deep emotional trauma that changed his mindset. Now, obviously, he still destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, but it almost caused him to want to end the depravity and then try and create anew and everything else. And then that sort of softened him after he basically, killed everybody with the, everything, the stories of Noah's Ark and everything else. And, there's a whole lot of other stories that kind of go on about, how he was worse prior to X, Y, or Z events. And then now he's not as bad, right? In the New Testament, kind of the modern day concept is that he's a loving and kind God. So basically, that's the theory. Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just normal angels, it was God on a mission disguised as angels. That being said, this obviously has a whole lot of implications. Basically, that this story was completely toned down, because the story in the Bible is very much a lot more PG than that. It doesn't really talk about the angels being actually assaulted. It talks about, them being afraid, or not afraid, but basically that, obviously I have not read this in a while, but basically talks about, the people trying. They were attempting this action. They were attempting this evil, but they didn't necessarily succeed, or it kind of leaves it ambiguous. This basically says that there is no ambiguity, that it did in fact happen, and that because it happened, and because these angels weren't actually angels, God had a change in mindset. So the last part was kind of deep, so I do want to kind of go into a little bit of a lighter concept when it comes to the whole ideology of ego death. A lot of the thoughts and a lot of the interpretations of ego death does have to do with divine entities and some sort of transcendent beings. But there's also the concept that you or I could transcend, have said ego death, and then become a god or become a deity. And there's actually one thing I saw that was really kind of funny. Basically, ego death is a form of transcendence that can make you a god, kind of as I mentioned, but it's often related to and often requires psychedelics and or hallucinogens. which is great, honestly. That's pretty amazing. There was actually, when I Googled this initially, because when you just Google it, there's a lot of stuff that's like LSD and ego death, LSD and transcendence, and LSD and ego death becoming a god. And, there's a lot of stuff about that. There's also like a SoundCloud rapper who did a song about God's ego death. So, as I guess as a lighter note, bonus around here, do a shit ton of LSD or other hallucinogens and potentially become God. Now, that sounds like a good time, if not my last time. So, keep that in mind, I guess. But anyhow, I wanted to kind of end on a little bit of a lighter note since the previous story was a little more deeper and sort of dark and kind of cruel. So, yeah, LSD, hallucinogens, becoming God. So that'll about wrap it up. I think this is a little bit more of a shorter episode overall. So hopefully you guys still enjoyed it. God's ego death really is a more of a simpler concept. Obviously, there's a lot more details that you could go into, but the very core principles of God's ego death and a lot of the main theories about it, which I kind of elaborate on, it really isn't that deep. I've seen deeper theories such as God's last wish. God's last wish really is this convoluted down the rabbit hole type deal where you kind of start going down the rabbit hole and then you keep going deeper. But I want to give some special thanks. Special thanks to some people on Reddit. First of all, the R Wendigoon subreddit. They were talking about it on there. The two people that I really pulled a lot of my information from was Taurus Washingburn, and then Jacinto Perfecto _Perfecto. Those two folks had a lot of good information, so I want to thank them. Obviously, if anybody for whatever reason does not want this information included, or you do not like the content usage of this video, get a hold of me. We'll talk it out. I figure since it's on a social media platform like Reddit, should be fine. This is another one of those situations where I didn't have a chance to actually ask them. Plus, it was on an older Reddit, I believe. So, anyhow, hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully there's no issues with people using, me using people's, explanations and thoughts and theories. And if there is, let me know. Hit us up on social media. But with that being said, hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave us a like and a subscribe. Comment down below what you think. Do you have your own thoughts about, God's ego death or God's last wish even? Last video was a pretty good video too. So I'd be curious to see people's thoughts on, ideas about that. But yeah, anyhow, stay safe out there. If you want to join the Geek-Stew crew, let us know online. Let us know on social media. Hit us up. And don't do LSD to become a god. I'm going to give you that little catch there. Is that what I was talking about? That was a complete joke. I don't know if that's real or not, but I'm not going to encourage anybody to do any sort of hallucinogen to try and, ascend to a divine being. So with that out of the way, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy, trust no one, and always question. Thanks.